Today's lecture is about the themes of art, and it's important to understand that what you are looking for and to try to understand is that the theme is the purpose of the artwork. So, why the artwork was made, not the purpose it serves now. For example, Mona Lisa, which all of you should know by now, what the Mona Lisa is, if not before you came to class. The Mona Lisa was a commissioned portrait of a real woman. So that was the original purpose. Now it is an extremely important historical painting. But when you're looking at which theme the artwork will fall under, it's important to think about that original purpose of why it was made. So originally, because it was a commissioned portrait, that purpose is what we would use to find the theme that Mona Lisa would fall under. So even though it is a very important historical painting, we wouldn't use that history to determine its theme. So the first thing I'm going to do is go through the different themes and give you a little bit of information about each one. And then we're going to look at some artworks, and I will explain them by providing a little bit of context, which you learned about in our last lecture, and then explain which theme it fits under and why. So the first theme here is invention and fantasy. So as a reminder, these themes are from the chapter 3 in your textbook. If you haven't read the chapter yet, make sure you pause this video, go back and read the chapter first, because these are going to be quick explanations, and some of them might not make sense, or it might be difficult to understand some of this information without reading the full explanation with examples. So if you look, I do have this chapter available as a PDF to give you a little bit more time to get your book. So it is in your D2L module here, in your reading section. Invention and fantasy is an artwork that is absurd, fantastical. It has dreamlike ideas. For instance, the movement surrealism is kind of not kind of fits into this theme, because surrealism is a movement about dreamlike states and fantastical artwork, absurd ideas and things like that. So in invention and fantasy, you are going to find things that don't exist in reality, artworks that show something that didn't exist yet when at the time the artwork was made. For example, Da Vinci made all sorts of inventions, including many that now exist, like the elevator and the tank, flying machines, and things like that. Now, of course, these things exist today, but at the time that he drew them up and thought of them, they were not yet invented. So it's important to kind of understand that the invention and fantasy, you have to consider where it exists in time as well, from the creation of the artwork. The next theme is art for art and its institutions. This is art that is inspired by another artwork, a movement. Remember that group style when you're thinking about the style terms. Media, meaning a drawing that's inspired by a sculpture or a sculpture that's inspired by a type of drawing, etc. Or in terms of its institutions, art that challenges the art world in some way. For instance, the example they provide in the book is feminist artwork that's challenging the institution of art, where female artists aren't getting the recognition they deserve. Um, the next theme is picturing the here and now. And this is art that looks at what's happening in the everyday world around us. It can be something simple like a still life, looking at everyday objects. This doesn't mean that an artwork has everyday objects in it. Remember, a still life is the definition of when an artist sets up objects to paint or draw. So they're literally setting up objects to paint or draw in a still life. Um, or it can be looking at um, going deeper and looking at the everyday, questioning society. So, daily work, city life, or questioning how society actually functions or doesn't function. Global warming might fall into this category unless it has a political component. The sacred realm is going to be artwork that deepens your spiritual connection or faith to any of the many world religions. Reflecting on the human experience is going to be the next one. And this is artwork that looks at what it means to be human or how we might experience the world. This is going to be a singular experience. Whereas when we were looking at kind of the everyday world, that would be discussing society. So, this is like a more personal experience where you might look at like self-knowledge, grief, what it's like for to experience life, um, and the different qualities of humanity, psychology, um, and things like that. Um, the next category is stories and histories. And this is one of the most broad categories because there's several different definitions that fall into this category. And they're more separate. So it's important to kind of understand the different things that fall here. So artworks that record history in some way, um, the artwork will fall into this category. Recording history can be done in a variety of ways, um, and this can be something simple, um, but it's showing like an event in time. It is commemorating that event in time, a monument, a memorial, um, photographs or paintings that are meant to, or sculptures, right, that are meant to kind of document history or remember an event. Even the photos that you have in your phone to commemorate your loved ones, though it's not you know meant to be remember someone important to the greater world, it's meant to remember someone for you. And so that is still a type of commemoration. Um, Epic tales of heroes. Uh, and there's many artworks that deal with this. So it's like telling, the tale of some important hero. If we think of like the Odyssey, the book, um, that's telling this grand Greek journey, artworks that tell parts of that tale, that kind of narrative work, that talk about the journey, even the illustrations in that book, those are part of stories and histories. Stories of the Greek gods and goddesses. It's important to understand that the Greek gods and goddesses don't fall under the sacred realm. And the explanation here I have in the slide is not um, described quite as well as maybe it could. Many of these stories are known to be true, like which is totally accurate. Um, as they've excavated and archaeologists have gone and they've been able to prove that a lot of it has actually happened. For instance, Troy, the story of Troy, there's a lot of truth to what happened um, in Troy. However, it's also important to understand that dead religions, like the Greek gods and goddesses, the Egyptian gods, um, the gods and goddesses from the Viking era, and um, so on and so forth. These are no longer religions that are practiced. And so the sacred realm is for spirituality and for um, artworks that are meant to actually pay homage to religion and spirituality. And so if that religion no longer exists in the world, it becomes a story or a myth rather than paying homage to something that someone still believes in. And so that's why it moves into this category and becomes a story instead. It's important to kind of understand that. So, for instance, the birth of Venus is a very famous artwork from the Renaissance, and it tells the story of the Greek goddess Venus and how she came to be in the world. And so that would fall into this category, stories and histories, because at the time that it was created during the Renaissance, she was considered a myth. There was nobody who still believed in that Greek religion. But if a sculpture of Venus from the Greek times was created, it would fall in which there are Greek sculptures that still exist from Greek times, from that classical period. Those would fall under the sacred realm because it was created when they were actually paying homage to the goddess Venus. And so, just so you understand, again, it's all about the purpose for which it was made. And so, during the Greek period, when they were actually worshiping that goddess, it would go under the sacred realm. So, just to make sure you fully understand that. Another thing that falls under stories and histories is narrative artwork. Now, narrative artwork is artwork that tells a story, but sometimes the story is a little bit looser and interpreted by the viewer. But it's still obvious that there is a story being told, but it's not as obvious as the birth of Venus being the story, and you know what the story is from beginning to end. Um, so it might be a little bit more open-ended, but it is still obvious that there is a story there, and you have bits and pieces of the story that you put together yourself. Um, and so it's important to kind of understand that is something that will go into this category. Politics and social order is any artwork that deals with politics, political leaders, or artwork in protest of it. Now, keep in mind that sometimes there is going to be artwork of a political nature that deals with history or tells a story, but if you think about the reason it was made, most often the reason it was made was for a political purpose, and it will fall into this category first. Just like religious artworks, even if they're meant to tell a story, their main purpose is that religious purpose, and so they would fall into the sacred realm. And so it's important again to always go back to that main purpose. The last category is the natural world, and this is artwork depicting the natural world or work that brings our focus to the natural world. One of my favorite artworks that I ever saw was a sculpture. Actually, it was like this installation, and it was this big plastic cloud. There were humidifiers in the room, and there were these. It was not pretty to look at, really, and there are these tin foil containers on the floor filled with water. And what happened was, because of the humidifiers, it was soaking water into the air, like pulling the water from the containers on the floor into the air. Those containers, they looked like the kind of like catering containers that you see at like potlucks, if you can kind of imagine. Um, and so, in it, the big plastic, it looked like a big plastic cloud just hanging from the ceiling. So the humidifiers were pulling the water from those containers into the air. And when enough of it got into the air, it was sticking to the plastic cloud. And when enough of it stuck, it started to rain. And it was, and I've seen a ton of work, I've seen a lot of beautiful work, but there was something really simple and very beautiful about how it represented kind of the natural um, rain cycle, and in a very simplified way. And then that rain, the plastic containers were underneath the cloud, and so it would fall back into the foil, excuse me, not plastic, foil containers, and it would, the process, it would just continue. And so it just represented kind of that, the rain cycle. And it was very simple, but it was just kind of a very beautiful idea. And so something like that would fall into the natural world, um, but so would like a landscape painting. Um, so just to kind of keep in mind the wide variety of things you might find in that category. So now that I've explained things, we're going to jump into our different artworks. This is one of my favorite little artworks. It's so cute, but very absurd. This is Marat Oppenheim. The title of this work is Objet from 1936. It's a fur-covered cup, saucer, and spoon. And it totally makes me a hypocrite because as a vegetarian, especially for ethical reasons, having a fur-covered teacup is not something I'm supposed to be okay with, but there's just something very aesthetically pleasing here. And this particular artwork falls into the movement Surrealism. And if you remember, I was explaining earlier about how Surrealism is about dreamlike states and fantasy. Obviously, this isn't a teacup that you want to drink out of. And so it's important to kind of understand that. Because of that, this does fall into the invention and fantasy theme. And I'll just tell you a little bit about the artwork. So this object was inspired by a conversation between Oppenheim and Pablo Picasso at a Paris cafe. After admiring Oppenheim's fur-covered bracelet, Picasso remarked that one could cover anything with fur, to which he replied, even this cup and saucer. Soon after, when asked by André Breton's Surrealists leader to participate in the first Surrealist exhibition dedicated to objects, Oppenheim bought a teacup, saucer, and spoon at a department store and covered them with the fur of a Chinese gazelle. In doing so, she transformed genteel objects traditionally associated with feminine decorum into sensuous, sexually punning tableware. And let me kind of explain that, because a lot of times students can't wrap their head around that. So the reason why it does that is, first of all, think about like a tea party with that would use fine china, that is something associated to females. It doesn't mean that men can't have a tea party with fine china, especially in our ever evolving climate in a contemporary society. But but generally speaking, it is um, thought of as a feminine activity. Uh, so these objects have kind of a feminine um, feel to them. Now, she then wrapped them in the pelt of a Chinese gazelle. So this has this becomes a female pelt. Now, very old slang, it's not, and at the time period when this was created, um, back in 1936, slang for uh, a woman's pubic hair uh, was her pelt, a woman's pelt, a female pelt. So that is where kind of taking these genteel objects and making them overtly sexual comes from. Um, and so we have kind of this give and take in that. Now, also the other thing that offers kind of that that overt sexual undertone is the fact that we have the teacup, which is an opening, and the long hard spoon, which is meant to go inside that opening. And we see those two things that are meant to work together. And though not always, but often, if you're taking something feminine, it already has a little bit of a sensuous or sexual feel to it, and it has an opening and a long hard object that's supposed to go into it, you're gonna have that sexual play. Um, Especially when you're supposed to pour warm, hot liquid into it and drink it all up until you're satisfied. So if you're thinking about why this has, that overt sexual um, undertone, that's where that comes from. The next artwork is Hang Up, and this is a minimalist sculpture that's making a statement about painting. Minimalism came in the 60s, which came right after um, abstract expressionism and color field painting. Both of these were painting movements that was paint about paint. They had these extreme theories about how the paint itself was important and letting go of all ideas and how important painting was. And with that, um, as those two movements were coming to an end, minimalism crept in, and minimalism was mostly sculpture, and mainly because there was a big reaction um, against having these kind of convoluted, overbearing um, rules and ideas that determined what you were supposed to do, and kind of forced your hand in your art. And there was this theory about how it killed painting, and painting was dead, and had all of these kind of ideas associated with it. And a lot of the sculptors um, reacted against the painters in a very physical way. And so here, if you look, what we're looking at, it looks like we're looking at the back of a painting, right? It looks like Eva Hesse um, has taken the painting, flipped it around so that the canvas is pushed up against the wall, and is saying the most interesting part about this art, about painting, is the back of it. And so she's making a very strong statement then about painting, right? And how the painting is not interesting, right? The canvas isn't interesting. There's no point in looking at the canvas. We're not interested in that anymore. And that was kind of a big statement, no, though there is some painting in minimalism, don't get me wrong. There was a big kind of um, push towards that in minimalism. And so you notice that in minimalism, most minimalism is sculpture. So this wasn't just something that she was saying, but that actually um, was kind of a an overarching thought throughout minimalism for most of the artists. So this is when we talk about art for art and how it is an artwork making a comment or is inspired by another artwork or art medium. This is what we're talking about, where this is a painting, this is a sculpture about painting. So this is kind of making an ironic comment about painting. Um, Now, I'm going to move into Picasso's Blue Period. For a period of time, Pablo Picasso painted a series of monochromatic artworks. And some of the artworks in the period, though most of them are monochromatic, meaning he only used blue, some were primarily blue, and he used a tiny bit of other colors. Uh, it's known as Picasso's Blue Period. And the reason why he had a blue period, he had several color periods. He had a rose period and a blue period and several others. He dedicated this particular period of time to a friend who had recently committed suicide. And he chose this color because he felt it expressed the sadness and despair um, that he felt while he was overwhelmed by his grief. Um, Now, I know I'm showing you two different artworks on this slide, and even if it's in the same body of work or the same series, it's important to understand that we always look at each work individually to determine a theme, because the purpose of each work might be different. Both of these works, though, seem um, to search that it seems that the figure is searching for some sort of answer, or perhaps questioning what makes the woman human. Both of them seem to ache or hurt. Their eyes seem to feel some sort, like there's some emptiness in their eyes. Um, they both look to be in emotional pain or turmoil, and it makes them look fragile and human, which is why reflecting on the human experience is the most appropriate theme for these artworks. However, this is also in Picasso's Blue Period. This is the old guitar player. This is one of his most famous works from this period. Um, he does look broken. He looks almost underfed. But this particular work doesn't seem to be about the guitar player's grief. His head is hung low and his eyes are closed, but it appears to be in concentration as he plays. The color blue may evoke sadness, but he has a feeling of perseverance about him and a hidden strength. And the longer you look at the artwork, the more of his story you glean. The more you know about him, the guitar player, not Picasso. You start to understand who he is and you feel for him. But his story isn't linear like that in a storybook. So it's not a work that we would call narrative because it's not like this is a story being told and that you have bits and pieces of it and you're starting to understand what that story is that Picasso's trying to tell you. It's just that you're getting a better idea of the guitar player's human experience. It's almost as if you can imagine where he's at, like he's by the subway, and he might be homeless and he's doing what he can to try to survive. Like you're putting the pieces together of who he might be. But it's not an actual story that Picasso is trying to narrate for you or has actually given you enough information in the painting to actually want to tell you that story. He's just, um, there's just enough there to get a better idea of who he is. But the actual emotions are different than the two women we just saw. Um, so even though the reading of the artwork is different, the painting still would actually go into the same category, reflecting on the human experience, because we are still reflecting on what makes him human. It's just a different type of human experience. This is more about perseverance and hidden strength than about grief and loss. Now, what's interesting is here we have photographer Christina Lewis in collaboration with Lone Wolf Magazine, who did a series. So, photographer Christina Lewis, in collaboration with Lone Wolf Magazine, did a series inspired by Picasso's Blue Period. These artworks would fall under Art for Art. A link to the article is actually in your in the module under the reading, so you can take a look at it. It's a great little article. And so you can take a look at this. But because this photographer, these photographs are inspired by Picasso's Blue Period, she's inspired by another artist, and the photographs are inspired by painting, this would fall under that Art for Art. Now here we have Vincent van Gogh's The Bedroom, painted in 1889. There are 3 different versions of this composition, and it is of his bedroom at that he was living in while he stayed in Arles in the south of France, which he envisioned to be the studio of the South. And in this particular artwork, which we will talk about this work throughout the semester, he makes his state of mind quite clear. The space itself is confined. He closes off both doors. We have the door on the left here closed off by the chair. We have the door on the right closed off by the bed. The windows look as if they don't open because they've been kind of forced and aren't the right size for the window. The walls themselves look as if they're kind of closing in or caving in. They're not proportioned properly. The paintings on the wall look like they could fall off onto the bed that's way too big for the room, making things out of proportion and uncomfortable. And so it provides an intimate view into the mind or psyche of the artist, because he actually writes to his brother Theo every day, and he talks about this painting and says, like, it's such a peaceful place, and yet he's not showing us a peaceful place. And so it allows us to understand his mental state, because he doesn't actually comprehend or understand that the difference between the fact that what he sees as peaceful but what he's showing is has is not. He's showing us like an isolated, claustrophobic, and lonely, and kind of disrupted space. And so by being able to see the difference between what he thinks he shows and what he's actually showing, it allows us to see how far his mind has gone. And what's interesting about that is that this is painted 1 year before he committed suicide. And so it's important to kind of understand that mental health is a very, very serious illness, and it's important to understand how clouded your mind can be with it. And this is a perfect example of not being able to understand like where your brain is. In fact, in the letter, it says, "It's just simply my bedroom. Only here color is to do with everything. To be suggestive here of rest or sleep in general. In a word, looking at the picture ought to rest the brain, or rather the imagination." And so it just kind of gives you an idea of like how vastly different that is from the effect of like when you look at this, you have kind of a very different read or take on it, because it causes a lot of anxiety. Um, and so I it is believed, though they didn't have this terminology back then, it's believed that he was bipolar. So now a lot of art for art artworks have been created based on the bedroom, and I'm going to show you two of them. This is an installation that was created inspired by two different works and artists. So this is inspired by the bedroom, obviously, but also inspired by Roy Lichtenstein, who was a pop artist. And so you'll see kind of that comic book reference as well. You see the Ben-Day dots in the back, and the very comic-esque look to it. And then here, what is a another example of an art for artwork. This is an actual um, um, Airbnb in Chicago that I don't know that it's still one that you can stay in, but it was in Chicago that you could stay. Um, and here's one more view of what's on the table while you were visiting Chicago. And so that again was an art for artwork, kind of as an installation. This is a wooden sculpture, a guanyin. A guanyin refers to a Buddhist Vahistava, which is someone who has reached nirvana but stays on earth to help others to reach it. They're associated with compassion and venerated chiefly by followers of Mahayana Buddhist schools as practiced in the Sinosphere. This obviously would fall in the sacred realm because it is someone worshipped in Buddhism. This is a self-portrait done by Chuck Close. And Chuck Close is a really interesting artist. He has facial blindness. So if you ever meet him, he won't recognize you if he ever sees you again. He has prosopagnosia, commonly known as facial blindness. He sees the parts of your face but he can't put those parts together in a pattern and remember them. He once failed to recognize a woman he had lived with for a year. However, if he transforms a photograph of you into one of his huge portraits, he may be able to remember your face, at least as if he's looking at you straight on. And so he started painting people close to him in his life um, so that he could start to remember them. He has many disabilities. He says, once I change the face into a two-dimensional object, I can commit it to memory. I have a photographic memory for things that are two-dimensional. Everything about my work is driven by my disabilities. If you take a look here, this is a big self-portrait done in 1967. This is an oil on canvas painting. This is what Chuck Close's work used to look like. This was his signature style and had been the cover of Time magazine back in the 60s. He was famous for this work back then, but he became paralyzed from the chest down because he had a collapsed artery supplying blood to his spinal cord in the late 80s at the age of 48. And rather than giving up after months of therapy, he regained some use of his hands and arms, but lost fine motor control and had to resort to a slightly larger pixels filled with less detailed shapes. Still, a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art 10 years after his paralysis challenged viewers to identify paintings made before Close's stroke with those made after, and if you could do so. The artist said the stroke didn't make me better, but it didn't stop me. Close is best known for huge portraits created from a straight-on photograph he has taken of the subject's face. Today, Close wheels around his studio in Lower Manhattan in an electric wheelchair and works on giant canvases mounted on an electric easel that lifts and rotates with the push of a button. He wears a brace that supports his paintbrush and allows his weakened hands to make it do whatever he wants and allows him to work 8 to 12 hours a day. Close is more prolific than ever and is believed to be one of the wealthiest artists alive. But he gives no credit at all for his success to special talent or inspiration. Inspiration is for amateurs, he says. I just show up and get to work. You don't need to be more gifted than anybody else. You just have to work harder. So this work would fall under stories and histories because he's painting artworks. These are self-portraits, so this is commemoration. He's commemorating himself. But even if they were artworks of other people, again, that falls under commemoration because he's commemorating them. So talking about how prolific he is, how famous he is, here we have Chuck Close, William J. Clinton, born 1946. This was done in 2006. It's oil on canvas and is in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. For those of you who don't know, every president has their presidential portrait painted, and it hangs in the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. And they often choose one of the most famous artists of their time to paint their portrait, and Chuck Close was selected by President Clinton to paint his. Now, this particular artwork, even though it commemorates President Clinton, would fall under the politics and social order because it commemorates him as our political leader. Here we have Dorothea Lange's Migrant Mother from 1936, and this is housed at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. this particular artwork um, was taken by Dorothea Lange. She was hired um, by the U.S. government's Farm Security Administration, which formed during the Great Depression. She was sent to Nepoma, California, so that she could document the plight of the migrant farm worker, to raise awareness of and provide aid to the impoverished farmers. Lange came across Florence Owens Thompson and her children in a camp filled with field workers whose livelihoods were devastated by the failure of the pea crops. This particular artwork falls under the theme Picturing the Here and Now. This is looking at what's going on around us. Now, certainly this is recording history, but remember, when you're looking at the theme, you're looking at the purpose for why it was made. And I just explained that purpose, right? She was hired by the Farm Security Administration to document the plight of the migrant farm worker. And that is picturing the here and now. So it was not meant to record history, but happened to do so, right? So that would be kind of a secondary thing. And sometimes students think of stories and histories in terms of commemoration because it is a photograph of Florence Owens Thompson and her children. But keep in mind that this photograph was the face of poverty throughout the Great Depression, and I'm sure some of you, a lot of you have probably seen this before, and is still used as like the photograph of poverty. And so actually, Thompson agreed to allow to have her photograph be taken as long as she could remain anonymous. And it wasn't until like the 1970s when she finally agreed to be interviewed by a reporter because her children were long grown, that she finally allowed herself to be known and was no longer anonymous. So, but keep in mind, that's 40 years later. So for 40 years, she was completely anonymous. Think about it like this. Would you want to be commemorated for being poor? And I can't imagine any of you would say yes to that question. So, really think through your answers as you're coming up with a theme for the artwork, because you don't want to think too quickly and come up with an answer like that. And last but not least, we have Ansel Adams' Clearing Winter Storms, circa 1937. Keep in mind, remember that C period before that 1937 means about, from a academic standpoint, this is the closest we can get because we know that Ansel Adams was here at Yosemite documenting the park at this time period, but this particular artwork we don't have the date on, so we can't say for sure that this was taken in 1937, but that's the closest date that we can provide for it. And unless we can provide definitive proof, we're not going to provide a date without that circa. Ansel Adams' love of nature and his work in capturing vistas within the Sierras and other protected lands changed the American art world to include nature photography. His work became an important part of the American conservation movement, providing a constant reminder of the landscapes that need to be protected. One of the most important legacies of Adams is the way in which his photographs contributed to the American conservation movement. His technical expertise and the undeniable beauty of his works paved the way for photography to be exhibited beside traditional painting in portraiture and national galleries, which had never been done before. The portfolios that Adams published gained worldwide recognition and made America famous for its special public lands. It is because of Ansel Adams' artworks, these photographs, that the national parks were protected. At the time, there was consideration that the national parks might be closed and that the land might be developed on, which is why that conservation movement started. And his work started being published internationally, and people started sending money to the government. Not just Americans, but worldwide, people started sending money to the government to save our national parks. And the response became so large that Ansel Adams is directly responsible for ensuring that our national parks be saved and stay open. And so it's important to kind of understand how important art is, and how artists really can have a big influence on making changes in the world. And Ansel Adams is a big is an example of that. Talking about his technical expertise, one of the things that Ansel Adams is so well known for, which I spoke about on our last lecture, but just to remind you, is using that filter, that special filter, that red filter, to get the beautiful atmospheric perspective in here, which we'll talk about again in our next lecture when we discuss the elements. But as you read chapter 4 and you get to space as an element, pay special attention to that atmospheric perspective, because it'll explain it quite nicely. And that's all that we have for you for this particular lecture. Of course, this falls under the natural world because it's landscape photography. The conservation movement is about protecting our land and conserving the planet. So it would certainly fall under that theme. And I look forward to seeing you guys soon.